Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to see you. We are coming back from having maybe a 2-year or so hiatus from having an in-person event, so we are buzzing with excitement. Welcome, welcome. I am Dr. Sheryl Kennedy-Haydel. I have the privilege of serving as a director of the School of Communication and Design here at Loyola University. And one thing we pride ourselves on is being a place where students can come and become an industry leader in storytelling. So whether that's journalism, design, public relations, advertising, we offer it all, right? So what's special also about today is we're kicking off a new lecture series that we've entitled Conversations, right? So our first conversation is with our native son, Clint Smith. So, like, we are storytellers. You all know what a storyteller Clint is, right? So this marriage, this arrangement for this evening, to me, couldn't be even more perfect, to have someone of his stature and caliber come back home and have his first solo book discussion right here on Loyola's campus. So we're extremely excited about that. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it off to our own Will Sutton, but he's also a columnist with the New Orleans Advocate, Times-Picayune. So he wears 2 hats, but today he's wearing a hat of moderating this very noteworthy discussion that we're gonna have. So from here, I'll hand it off to you. And thank you all again for coming.
Thanks a lot, boss lady. I like the sound of that. I am thrilled to be here with you all today, and I'm particularly excited to have, for those who don't know, my nephew, the author of How the Word is Passed. Since he's my nephew, obviously I've known him for a couple of years. I've had the great honor and privilege of having his mother as my sister for all of her life. And we've been in the lives of my dad for much of his life. They're here, as is Clint's dad, juvenile court judge Clint Smith, and his wife, Dr. Sheryl Sutton Smith. And we're at an academic institution. I can't help but a moment of recognizing Clint's grandfather, Dr. William W. Sutton. Former president of Mississippi Valley State University, and I will say he earned his doctorate in 3 years. So Clint is with us today. We've got limited time. We are so happy that he's here. We are going to, of course, talk about the book, but I thought we'll use this opportunity to talk about a little bit about how you got to the book and how the book has come to shape some of your thinking. But I know some of your growing up in New Orleans has shaped your thinking, some of your experiences and all. So I thought I'd start with, rather than kind of the introduction that you all can Google and look up, some words or titles, if you will. And if I get anything wrong, you just feel free to tell me. So Clint is an advocate, an author, an educator, a journalist, a philosopher, a thinker, and a writer. He's also a son, a grandson, a brother, a cousin, a nephew, an Alpha Phi Alpha man, husband, father, and friend. And I intentionally cited those things. I certainly could have added some others, but I've watched you grow and develop, and I know that there have been points in your life when you have got a little bit of this or a little bit of that I can kind of see in your work and when reading your poetry and all. We're not going to baby pictures. All right, but we are going to go to early days. Slide, please. Slide. So in the early Clint days, there were a number of things, but one of those slides was soccer. And so some of you might not realize how important soccer has been to Clint Smith. And so if you would just tell them a bit about where the heck soccer comes from and why that's been so important in your life.
Also, where the heck that hair went. It's a long time ago. Well, thank you all so much, first and foremost, for coming. It's amazing to see so many friendly faces, and see like some of my old teachers are here, some of my old Cub Scout leaders are here, some people I've known throughout my entire life. So this is a real treat. And you know, for me, if anybody who knew me growing up knew that all I cared about was soccer. I mean, it was just like soccer this, soccer that. I had convinced myself that I was going to be a professional soccer player. I was going to play for Arsenal, a soccer team in London. I was going to have millions of dollars and, you know, do the red carpet thing. And that it did not work out that way, because you grow up and you realize that 1990s Louisiana is not necessarily a hotbed of soccer talent against which to measure your skills on a global level. So it's interesting because soccer was everything, and it was, I really don't know who I would be without it. I mean, it kind of, you know, in so many ways, it kept me from getting into trouble, kept me from doing things I might have otherwise been curious about or inclined to do, because I really was so committed to this thing. And part of what happened, I think, is that I got to college and I got a Division I scholarship to play at Davidson College. Steph Curry is our claim to fame. And we were in the same class, and Davidson's a tiny place, so we all knew each other. But I got to Davidson and I didn't get a lot of playing time. And I kind of just rode the bench for 4 years. And I had this 19-year-old existential crisis where I was like, this thing that has defined me my entire life, I'm not good at anymore. And I didn't really spend a lot of time between the ages of 5 and 18 of like figuring out who I was beyond the soccer field. So a lot of college for me was attempting to figure out who I was, what I was passionate about, what I cared about beyond the context of soccer. But part of what happened is I think I took so much of the energy that I put into soccer all of those years and then kind of transferred it into new spaces. And I feel lucky to have gone to Davidson, which is a place where I was allowed to be on a Division I soccer team, but also allowed to do a whole range of other things. I got to join Alpha Phi Alpha. I was the editor of the opinion section of our newspaper. Worked with Big Brothers Big Sisters. Did a lot of voting rights activities, especially around the 2008 election. I started a poetry group, Free Word, and got really involved in the slam poetry and spoken word scene in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 20 minutes away. And I kind of just took all of that energy that I put into sports and put it into writing. And I entered writing in the context of like, I kind of found like the most sports adjacent thing, like writing thing that I could, which was the slam poetry competitions. And for people who are familiar with slam poetry, it's a poetry competition. You get on stage and 5 judges give you a score between 1 and 10. And so I think it was like the sort of, I don't know if this metaphor works, but like it was my sort of nicotine patch that was like helping me ease off my soccer addiction and allowed me to put that energy into a different space. And so I got really involved in the slam poetry scene, and then ultimately sort of started exploring different genres and different forms of writing that existed beyond the stage and beyond standing behind mics, and it kind of has evolved in ways that I could have never imagined.
So there was a unexpected transition that was a transition for lots of people. Hurricane Katrina very much changed your trajectory in good ways out of a bad situation. Can you talk about what, as you look back, what Hurricane Katrina meant for you and the pathways that you took Slide.
Oh man, all these photos. So Hurricane Katrina was my senior year of high school. So I think we evacuated 3 days into my senior year. I was at Ben Franklin, and I finished at a school, an international school in Houston called the Audi International School. Katrina, I think, has impacted me in ways that I'm still unpacking in many ways. I mean, this is what, like navigating with my therapist in some ways is like trying to think about how for a long time, I think like many people in different iterations, I kind of suppressed and pushed aside whatever trauma or whatever difficulties I was experiencing in any way that was related to Katrina, in part because I kind of looked around and I was like, well, my family, we lost our home, but so many people lost their home and my family's still alive and, we are doing okay. And I didn't feel like I had the right to feel, to sort of lean into and unearth those feelings of loss and grief and mourning of the city that I love, the city that raised me, and not being able to sort of, I had my own ideas of like what my final year in New Orleans would look like. My friends and I had, it was going to be in many ways, and I speak to a lot of high school students. In many ways, I think it's probably similar to a lot of college or high school seniors from 2020 who had their senior year disrupted by COVID, so they didn't get homecoming or prom or graduation or any, to finish their soccer season, to do all these things that they had imagined would be the sort of capstone of their childhood, the capstone of their high school careers. And I didn't get that with the people that I thought I would get that with, and with the community that I thought I would have it with. But part of what Katrina did too was it really, even before I had the language for it, illuminated the sort of sociological inequalities that existed in the United States. It was the most profound manifestation of inequality that I remember experiencing at that time in my life, because it was just so, even before I didn't have, the fancy theories and, the fancy scholars to cite, I could look at what was happening in New Orleans and say, this would never happen if this was a city of majority white people. Like, it would never happen if there were white people on these rooftops instead. Like, what happened in the Superdome would never happen if it wasn't poor, disproportionately black people. And so I think in the earliest ways, even when I didn't, maybe in ways that were unconscious, I started to get a sense of the way that inequality would manifest itself in this country, which ultimately I think helped put me on a trajectory where I was spending a lot of time thinking and reading and studying where this came from. Like, how did we get to a point where what we saw at the Superdome happens, right? Because it doesn't happen in isolation. It is the result of decades and generations of public policy decisions that have been made that have made it so that certain communities look one way and certain communities look another way. Certain communities don't have access to certain types of resources or the levers of upward mobility, and other communities do. And so I began to get really interested in this sort of larger picture, sort of social and historical and political precedents that created the space for something like Katrina to happen.
Slide, and then next slide. So Hurricane Katrina is in a number of ways a key reason how you got to Davidson. And Davidson added some different values that perhaps were unexpected experiences that helped you. Got the slide? Okay.
I don't know if they can hear you because of the mic.
Slide. There we go. That makes a difference, doesn't it? Okay. Thank you, nephew. And then the next slide. Then you got into education. And a lot of some of the things that you experienced and some things that you saw in the classroom And I started hearing that in your poetry and other conversations that you were having to talk about that, because I can see how that also influenced what we see as the last book and now this book.
Yeah, I was a high school English teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland for a few years before I went to graduate school. Man, I just think that like sitting with teenagers and talking about books was just the coolest job in the world. I mean, it just is like, it was so much fun. I didn't love waking up at 5:30 in the morning, but I loved sitting in a circle and like talking about books and literature and ideas with teenagers who are just such a funny group of people, because they like think their ideas of the world are so cemented and like so already formed, but they're also so at the same time so open. They're just so spongy, right? And they're so open to new ideas, and even when they don't necessarily recognize it. And so I love that job, and I tell people all the time that nothing in my life that has happened over the past several years would have ever happened without my years as a high school teacher. There's another version, an alternate reality in which I just would have been a high school teacher for 40 years and been perfectly content. Mm-hmm. But part of what happened was that I was spending time in this classroom, and I had a lot of undocumented students. My classroom was 95% Black and Latino kids. The vast majority of my students were on free and reduced lunch and lived in poverty. And I came into the classroom being fed a story that like education was the civil rights battle of our time, that if we could solve education, we would solve inequality. And I think that has been revealed since to be a sort of narrow conception of like how you understand what inequality is and how you create interventions to solve it. And so part of what I saw was that the school was part of like just one part of a much larger ecosystem of social, historical, and political realities that shape my students' lives every day. And I think the more time I spent with them, the more interested I got in trying to understand, again, those sort of larger forces in the same way that in a different context I did with Katrina, those larger forces that were shaping their lives. How does the history of housing segregation shape the lives of my students? How is the history of immigration policy shaping the lives of my students? How is the history and manifestation of the war on drugs and the war on crime and mass incarceration shaping the lives of my students? Because it can't be that, they're only in school for, 6-7 hours a day. And then they go out into a world in which there is, again, like decades of decisions and century and generations of history that have created the conditions in their community. I think all the time about this James Baldwin essay in 1964, based on a conversation he had with a group of New York City educators. And in it, it's called A Talk to Teachers. And in it, he talks about how the role of the teacher is to help the Black child understand that even though the world tells them over and over and over again that they are criminal, that it is in fact the society and the history that created the conditions that Black child is forced to grow up in that is actually the criminal, right? So, and in so many ways that's intuitive to many of us, but I think we can take for granted how it's not necessarily intuitive for many of our young people, and how so often young people, specifically young people and young Black people and young poor Black people specifically, are told all of the things that are wrong with who they are or where they come from, what they're doing wrong, what they need to do right. And it's not to say that you don't teach people that they need to work hard. It's not to say that you don't teach people that they need to push themselves as much as they can. But if you're doing that in isolation and you're not giving a young person the tools to understand why their community looks the way that it does in the first place, then I think you're doing a disservice to that young person, right? Because then they start to think that the reason their community looks the way that it does is somehow their fault, or somehow their parents' fault, or somehow the result of like a cultural disposition or a genetic inferiority, right? Like this same sort of junk science and pseudoscience and cultural pathology that has been so ever present in America for as long as America has existed. And so part of what became clear in my own pedagogy is that as much as I was an English teacher who was teaching my kids, we were reading Morrison and Ellison and Wright and Shakespeare and Whitman and all these folks, it was also trying to give my students the tools and the language and the framework with which to understand the realities of their community in a different way, so that they don't do what I think a lot of young black kids do, which is internalize the messages that this world tells you, and begin to believe some of the pathology that you're inundated with. And when I grew up here, I like many young black kids growing up here, I was inundated with these messages, some directly, some indirectly, some explicit, some implicit, that are, suggesting all the things that are wrong with black folks and all the things that black people need to do right, and the sort of cultural pathology of the public housing projects, and how more people in New Orleans go to prison than anywhere else in the world, and murder is because black people are hyper-violent. And I was getting all these messages, but no one was giving me the language to understand the sort of broader history that shaped why these things were happening in the first place, why these communities were so saturated with violence, why they were so saturated with poverty. And so, for me as a teacher, I tried to do my best to research for myself, first and foremost, to try to make sense of what those answers were, and then to the extent that I could share them with my students. And it got to a point where I realized that I wanted to step back and take some time so that I could better understand the same sort of sociology and history that I was trying to explain to my students, so that I might be able to, whether I come back into the classroom or become a writer or become a professor, for myself, have that language and have that understanding, and also then figure out ways to give more people the tools and information to understand it for themselves.
Fly. So you got to Harvard.
Yes, I did.
That's where we didn't practice this.
It feels like that all the time. Just cold. It looks cold in that photo. It was always cold.
But you had an opportunity to explore some of those things that you were feeling, the digging for the information that you wanted, examining things in a different way. And you had your own COVID experience when you reached toward the end of that journey with your dissertation slide. Because who does dissertations on Zoom?
Everybody now, yeah.
What was that like, and how did Harvard help you?
Harvard is a cool place. It's a cold place. It is a place that I'm grateful I had the opportunity to spend some time. It was not a place without its struggles. I mean, the first time I applied to Harvard, I didn't get in. I failed my comprehensive exams my third year, and if you failed them twice, you're kicked out of the program. And so I was, experiencing, that felt like a huge setback. I felt like I was on the brink, and I was sort of wrestling with how important it was to define yourself, or not have your sense of self singularly tethered to an institution, right? I think for a long time, it was hard to extract who I was from the institutions that I have been affiliated with. And that moment when it became clear that, like, oh, you might get kicked out of grad school, was a moment in which I had to start doing some real work for myself, where it was like, you are not defined by the things you create, or the school that you attend, or the job that you have, and really doing work to make sure that the sense of purpose and value that I had in my own life was tied to people, and tied to community, and tied to like a deeper sense of self that existed outside of sort of external and exterior factors. But I learned a lot. I mean, it is a real blessing to be able to go get a PhD that's paid for, and for my job for 6 years to read and to write and to think. I mean, it's hard to imagine that anything that's happened, and certainly this book would not have happened without that time. This wasn't my dissertation. This wasn't even what I studied in school. I was trained as a sociologist of education, and studied the relationship between education and mass incarceration. And so wrote my dissertation on the educational experiences of children who were sentenced to life without parole. And I'd been teaching in prisons throughout Massachusetts, and more recently at DC jail, for the past several years. And for me, it just became really clear that, again, and my family always makes fun of me because I always say this line, but it's true, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, it is very clear to me that I would have ended up, I could have easily ended up in the same conditions, behind the same bars that many of the students I worked with did. And that, but for the fact that I grew up in my home with parents who always made me feel safe, where I didn't have to worry about, where my next meal was going to come from, or experience a lot of the sense of desperation that so many in our community unfortunately have to navigate. It just became quite clear to me that there was, and this intellectually, but I think the more time you spend in a prison, the more time you spend with people who are incarcerated, the human part of it just becomes clear. And you're like, oh, you were just a kid who was growing up, again, and to allude back to Baldwin, growing up in the shadow of this history and in the shadow of this country that took so much from your community. And it puts your life on a trajectory that is difficult to pull yourself from. Not impossible, obviously, but it's incredibly difficult. And so I really wanted to understand how children who were told they're going to spend the rest of their life in a cage, what learning meant to them. Like, what motivates you to take a class? What motivates you to read a book? What motivates you to read Shakespeare, learn geometry, or go try to get a degree? When so many of the sort of ostensible, like, social utility pieces of education are taken away from you, because you're not going to buy a house, you're not going to buy a car, you're not going to, have a traditional job. And so I wanted to understand, like, what motivated people to learn in that case. So, and I feel really grateful to have studied that and have thought about it, and it's shaped, my work in all sorts of ways. But I ended up writing the book at the same time as the dissertation, which was a terrible decision. And I would never recommend that ever. And then we also were like, let's have some kids. And then it was a mess. So how was my experience in graduate school? Inelegant is what it was.
Yeah.
But the graduation on Zoom, this was in the early days of COVID. This was in April. And so we were like, oh, by July, we'll be good. I just sent our family group chat a video where it was like, my wife had taken a video of my kids, who at the time were 1 and 3, and they're like climbing on top of me, and I'm just laying on the floor, and I'm like, I can't do it anymore. And she was like, day 13. How much longer can we go? And I was just like, God, we had no idea. But it was amazing to do it on Zoom, and to have, my grandfather be able to be there, and have you be there, and like all these, all the little Zoom squares popped up at the end, and it was
pretty amazing. I think it was over 175 people.
Yeah,
probably.
I mean, it was like people who I like mowed their lawn when I was 12, and like who babysat me, who came to my site.
Yeah.
It was just a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, I did not get several years at Harvard, but my Neiman year was incredible, and you don't know what you're picking up at the time and how it might be helpful later. I had the wonderful opportunity. There were a number of professors, but one of them was Derek Bell, and I had the chance to have really strange conversations with him about something called critical race theory in 1987. This is not new. Let's suffice. So the book journey, if you don't mind, just turn and look at the screen. Slide.
Oh, you got tweets up there.
Yeah. Slide. 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 Your book took you to a number of different places, and without those visits, it's your book, but without those visits, I'm not sure you could have written the book that I've now read twice and listened to twice. You didn't know that. But.
I appreciate you.
But it's so rich, and you really put us there. You make us feel, have emotions that some of us have experienced, but maybe not in the same way. But can you talk about the journey of putting the book together to result in what we have now?
Yeah, I mean, Thank you for reading the book and listening to the book so many times. You're helping pay for my kids' college. It's, so the origin story of this book, which I've told a bunch of times, is that in May 2017, like many of us, I was watching the Confederate statues come down here in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents, even today, live on a street named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's obviously not to say that taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly, erase the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize the stories that have been told and the history that has created the contemporary conditions of American inequality. And I thought about my old professor at Harvard, Walter Johnson, who's an incredible historian. And he wrote a book called Soul by Soul, which is about the slave trade in New Orleans. And one of the first things he says in that book is that the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the roads enslaved people paved. It's in the levees enslaved people built. It's in the soil enslaved people are buried in. It's in the buildings enslaved people constructed. And so I was looking around and I tried to get a sense of, well, how is the story of this city, a city that was once the largest slave market in the country, how is that part of its history being told? And in what ways is it failing to be told? In what ways? I kind of realized that there were a lot of gaps in my own education, a lot of gaps in my own childhood that I needed to fill. And I started to sort of look around New Orleans and then kind of broadened it out to think about different places across the country, different historical sites, plantations, prisons, monuments, memorials, museums. Like, how were they telling the stories of this history? And how are those different ways that the story is told reflective of the different ways that Americans understand history? And I mean, we see manifestations of that, all the time now. That you have people who are living in fundamentally different realities because the history that they respectively understand of this country are completely different. And so kind of went on this 4.5 year journey, traveling around the country. Shout out to my mom who would come stay with my kids to allow me to not go into marriage debt too much, and allow me to go and do a lot of this traveling and this research. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what this book would be without going to those places. I mean, the book is, the places are the entry point into the history. And this book is, it's in part also a sort of homage and an ode to, and a celebration of the docents and the tour guides and the public historians and the descendants and all these people at these different places who taught me so much about his history. Norris Henderson, a guy who's here today, being at Angola with him, right? Being at Angola with someone who was in Angola themselves, who worked in these fields, who told me, I always remember when Norris said that we were leaving the prison, he was like, Clint, I can't explain to you what it felt like to work in a prison, picking cotton for 7 cents an hour, and to imagine that on this very land, my ancestors could have been picking cotton 200 years ago, right? And so like having those sorts of experiences with people for whom this history is not an intellectual abstraction, like it is in their bodies, it is in their bones, it's in the calluses on their hands, that they feel this every day, I think brought the story to life in a different sort of way.
So one of the things that you've dealt with through the years, but if we're honest, some of our viewpoints are changed and adjusted according to new information. And we've been dealing with names a lot here. We're going to move through a number of slides. I just want you to look at them, okay? And then I'm going to ask you a question. Slide. 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 So, is there a difference? What difference does it make with the names? And is there a difference to you with names of programs versus buildings versus streets after the kind of work that you've done to create this book and the journey that took?
I think there are different degrees of insidiousness, if you will, or like different than when we think about what names should stay, what names should go. So, for example, like the Confederacy, like statues and names of leaders of the Confederacy. I mean, I think that's the sort of low-hanging fruit of this debate. Like, there is no context in which it is appropriate to have people who were the leaders of, or participated in, or funded, or supported an endeavor to secede from the Union with the specific intention of raising an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. There is no context in which any of those people should ever be put on any school, lifted up on any pedestal, should be the name of any street sign. The Confederacy, they said it. They said what they stood for. I talk all the time about the declarations of Confederate secession, how in 1861, all of these different states, the southern states, seceded from the Union. And, I grew up and people were like, was the war about slavery? Was it not about slavery? How can we ever know? We can know. They said it. They wrote it down. They made speeches about it. And Mississippi in 1861 says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Like, they were like, it's about slavery, right? Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, he wrote a whole speech, the Cornerstone speech in 1861, where he was like, our nation is founded upon the great principle that the white man is superior to the black man and that white people have the right to have enslaved workers in perpetuity, and no other nation in the history of the world has ever been founded on this great principle. And then after the war, people went up to him and they were like, man, you just lost the war. You said that like no other nation was founded on the great principle of slavery. You said all these terrible things about black people. What do you have to say for yourself? And he was like, I never said that. What are you talking about? I was misquoted. Like, I never said anything like that. And people were like, what are you talking about? We were here. We heard you say it. Like, we were in the room. We listened to the speech.
Social media.
Right. But even then, that was sort of like a 19th century version of the gaslighting that we see today. Because even now, you look at January 6th, and people are trying to tell you that the thing you saw and the thing you heard isn't the thing, right? And it's a remarkable Orwellian real-time distortion of the facts that we're seeing, right? And in some ways, a lot of historians have been like, is this the sort of 21st century version of the lost cause, right? Where how are we going to talk about what January 6th was in 20, 30, 40 years? I mean, we're a year out, and you already have half the country who thinks it was this and half the country who was like, they were going to kill people, right? Because they said it. And so for me, going back to the statues, like there's no context in which a Confederate statue should be up. It is abhorrent, the idea that we would ever lift those folks up. I do think that people of good faith can have different ideas of what should be done with other statues. So a statue of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is somebody who, in my mind, represents the sort of cognitive dissonance of the American project. He wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and he also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. The story of Jefferson is complex, and it is filled with contradictions. It is filled with hypocrisy. He was undoubtedly central to the creation of the American project as we understand it, to the creation of the American idea. He's also someone who wrote extensively about how terrible slavery was, and also someone who then still continued to own and separate and beat enslaved people, right? And so should you have a statue of Thomas Jefferson? Should you not? I think that there are people, like I said, of good faith who can have disagreement. The person who wrote, a black historian who I admire so much, Annette Gordon Reed, who wrote the seminal books on slavery, on Jefferson's relationship to slavery, is someone who doesn't believe that statues of Jefferson should come down, but thinks that we should understand that we should have a very real understanding of who Jefferson was. You know, there's been conversations about Ben Franklin, there's conversations about Lincoln, there's conversations about, and it's not up to me to say like, that should be up or that should be down. I think it should be community oriented. I think it should be community based. And I think that we have to accept that whatever comes of it, there will be people who don't agree with the result. But I think the more important thing to my mind is that we're actually talking about it, right? And that we're actually saying, you know, Lincoln, for example, I don't know that I admire any other president more than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln also said some terrible things, especially early in his life, about black people and early in his life about indigenous people, right? But he also was someone who had the capacity and demonstrated the ability to evolve and to say this thing that I thought before was wrong. And I actually think this now. We never got to necessarily see his full evolution because he was killed less than a week after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. So, you know, I do think that this matters. But it isn't everything, right? Symbolism is not, it can be true that symbolism is not nothing, and also that it is not enough. And so the same thing when Juneteenth became a federal holiday. Some people were like, that doesn't matter. Like, we need voting rights. Juneteenth, this is just like, you know, this is irrelevant. This has nothing. I don't think it's fair or right to say that, right? I think that, because if I said that Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday doesn't matter, that would, to me, be doing a disservice to the generations of black activists, especially black activists in Texas, who have been fighting for this for generations. We can also say that it is great that Juneteenth is a federal holiday. It's absurd that it took 150 years for us to have a holiday to celebrate the end of one of the worst things we've ever done. And we say that in and of itself is not enough. And so, yeah, it's changing the names of Jefferson to Norman Francis. That's amazing. Changing the names of, you know, a lot of these street signs and taking down these statues is important. But it's important insofar that it serves as an entry point to have a broader discussion about the sort of material interventions that communities need in order to make it so that the ideological commitments that people like those had never get a chance to exist ever again.
So we want to get to some questions, but slide. Everybody wants to know.
Oh, I didn't even see that part. Oh, man.
There's going to be a movie or another book.
You know.
Gonna do a play. What we got coming?
I have a poetry book coming out next year. Okay. It's like a very different emotional tenor than this book. It's about, it's called Above Ground. It'll be out, I think, April of 2023. And it's about being a father. It's about like being a father to young kids. And so it's like a wide range of poems about how I never sleep. Poems that are like ode to the spit up on my shirt. And also just like, you know, my kids are just turned 3 and soon will be 5. And it's I like this part of this age because especially my almost 5-year-old has this just like remarkable sense of wonder around the world. Like the other day he was like, there was a ladybug in my room and I was like, why is there a ladybug in my room? I'm like chasing the ladybug with the newspaper. And he's like, Dad, have you ever looked at a ladybug? And I'm like standing on the chair being like, where's the ladybug? And I was like, he's like, let's look at the ladybug. And then, I mean, it almost is like a cartoon of itself where I'm like, get down, I like drop the newspaper and then we're like looking at the ladybug. And he was like, wow, what would it be like to be a ladybug? You know, and it's just like, the best part of it is like them regenerating a sense of wonder for me in the, especially with the natural world. And so it's a lot of stuff like that. So that's what's next. And I have the Crash Course Black American History series that
if you haven't seen it, it's really wonderful.
I appreciate it.
It's really wonderful, and I learn stuff every time I watch, and causes me to watch some again.
Yeah, we've been working on it for, it feels like forever. I signed up to do that in 2018. And so we had to like build out all the episodes and create, we have 50 episodes. We put 33 out so far. If you're not familiar with it, they're kind of these like 10 to 15 minute semi-animated videos about different parts of Black American history, profiling different people, different events. And I like that a lot because part of what I wanted as a teacher was like a resource like that, something that would, because kids you got to find different multi-dimensional, multimedia ways to engage young people. And part of why I went to graduate school in the first place was because I really rejected the idea that intellectual rigor came at the expense of accessibility. And I was just, I spent 6 years at Harvard among some of the best thinkers and scholars in the world, and was just constantly like, why are we only talking about this to each other?
Right.
Like there's so many, I would have done anything for some of this information when I was a teacher, when I was a 16-year-old, when I was 12, And so for me, part of what the Crash Course Black American History series allows me to do is to take a lot of the history that has been formative and transformative for me and to hopefully put it out to a wider public, and especially to young people who I think might not sit down and read How the Word is Passed, so they might not buy a book by an eminent historian, but they might watch a 10 or 15 minute YouTube video.
Yeah.
And so for me that feels really important. And there's some other stuff in the pipeline. We'll see. I mean, this book it's honestly, y'all, just been more than I could have ever dreamed of, and more than I could have ever imagined. I mean, this book has gotten more than what any writer can hope for in an entire career, in one book. So I just feel endlessly lucky. It is kind of the gift that keeps on giving, and the wave that they just pushed back we were supposed to have the paperback come out in June, and they pushed it back because it's just continuing to sell so well, and I thank you all for that, and people spreading the word, and so
slide. Kirby, where are you? Mr. Henderson's here. He's a character in the book. Where are you? All right, there he is. Got a question? Okay, no problem. All right. Okay, we're looking for questions. Ms. Gabby.
Hello, my name's Gabby Killett, and I'm a senior at Loyola, majoring in journalism this year. I have a question that's more asking for your opinion on a topic, Clint. I think that there's a dichotomy within communities of color and advocates within those communities where people are both sick and tired of having to educate our white counterparts, and also people are hopeful that at some point they will understand where we're coming from. And so I'm curious what your opinion is on how to navigate advocacy in communities of color, and what you think about pushing through prioritizing education when you feel so jaded.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So first and foremost, I don't think that it is any single person's responsibility to feel like they have to take upon themselves the task of like educating the masses of white people about marginalized people's history. That's a lot to ask of anyone, and I think that it's an individual decision that each person needs to make for themselves. And part of what I think about is so many of the guides and docents I met in this book, people like Dave Thorson, people like Yvonne Holden, people like Damaris Obi in New York. And there's a sort of both-andness to the way that they do their work, which is that they extend a certain level of grace and generosity to people who are coming, which is to say they're not going to judge someone for what they don't know when they show up there. But there is a demand and an expectation of accountability and responsibility, which is to say, like, they're not going to judge you for showing up and not knowing something, but when they share information with you, there is the expectation that you're going to sit with that, and you're going to hold that, and you're going to wrestle with that, even when it's jarring, even when it runs counter to all the information that you might have been told previously your entire life. I am not in the business of attempting to convince people who don't want to be convinced. Like I'm not going to try to sit here and like have a conversation with someone who is antagonistic toward fact and truth and empirical evidence. What I believe is that there are more people who just don't know, who are open to learning this information, than there are people who are inherently resistant to it. To be sure, there are people who are resistant to it. I went to, people who read the book, I went to spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans at a Confederate cemetery. And like, I wasn't in the business of trying to convince them to believe anything. I went there because I wanted to understand how one comes to believe something that has been consistently demonstrated to be false. But like, believe it deep in their bones, like believe it deep in their heart. And so for me, I'm much more interested in having conversations with people who don't know and who don't even know that they don't know necessarily. And I think just about the ways that in my own life, on issues of immigration, on issues of sexism, on issues of LGBTQ issues, on issues of indigeneity, on issues that I was not necessarily at some point very familiar with, that there were people who extended a level of generosity to me when they didn't have to, and invited me into a conversation and invited me in to do my own learning. It wasn't, we're gonna sit, they're not tutoring me, right? There's a difference between saying like, I'm gonna hold your hand through the field of racial reconciliation, and then somebody being like, have you considered this? You think about like, consider a set of perspectives that you might not have, and then leaving it up to me to make sure that the onus was on me to go do that work for myself. So I think there's a distinction there. But ultimately, again, it's up to each individual person, and it's also not all yes or all no. Like sometimes you might want to have a conversation with somebody who's trying to learn something about your culture, and sometimes you're like, I don't really want to have that conversation. You should go look on YouTube, right? Like, and I think that that's okay. Right, and I think it depends on where you're at, how you're experiencing it, what your relationship to that person is. Like, I'm gonna have a different kind of conversation with, with people I love and care about than people who are like approaching me with a certain level of like, oh, prove it to me. I'm not sure like, here to be a circus trick to you, right? Like if you're interested, we can have a conversation, but I'm not interested in trying to prove something to people who don't want, who are trying to do like a sort of gotcha. Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
Question?
Okay.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Hi, so I'm Terry. I'm a graduate of Loyola in criminal justice and sociology, and also the child of African Liberian immigrants, but I've lived my whole life in Louisiana. And one of the most shocking things reading your book, I'm only about halfway through, was learning about the 1811 revolt of enslaved people that happened. And it was angering because I'm 28 years old, and that was the first time that I'd ever heard that one of the largest rebellions happened in my state, literally like an hour away from where I was raised. And just, of course, about the horrific punishment that they suffered. So my question is, can you just expand on one, what it was like the first time you learned that and when, and also how much further you think Louisiana has to go to really address our own history, because people like me have grown up here our whole lives and never heard like the most basic of stories.
Yeah, I mean, I remember learning about that and being like, it just felt absurd that I had never been taught about that. And to take it even further, to think about how the Louisiana Purchase was only possible and only happened because of the Haitian Revolution, right? And that Napoleon had lost so many forces and lost so much money in the Haitian Revolution, the first place where, the first country to form a black republic, the first place where black people abolished slavery themselves and freed themselves from the sort of yoke of Europeans, is that he was so disillusioned that he basically, Jefferson's envoys came and they were like, can we buy this little area around the Mississippi? And he was like, nah, take all that. Like, take it all. He's like, 4 cents an acre, take it. I don't want anything to do with North America anymore. And like, that only happens because of the largest, I mean, even before 1811, but like the largest slave revolt in the world, right? That happened in Haiti and made possible the existence not only of Louisiana, but like a third of this country. And so I was constantly encountering pieces of information where I was kind of looking around and I was just like, why didn't I learn this in my 8th grade Louisiana history class? All the time, constantly. And I recognize that, like, when you're a social studies teacher or a history teacher, there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of stuff. But it felt like I was constantly finding information that was not like peripheral to the story of America, but was like central to it. And that had not been shared with me. And it's not because I had great teachers in my education, but part of the effectiveness of the sort of 19th century lost cause propaganda is that it has distorted our education system so much that, like, many of my teachers weren't taught this thing, right? And they weren't taught it in their professional development sessions, and they, the people who run the professional development sessions weren't taught. I mean, it goes so far back. And so it's not a sort of like, it's not a matter of looking around and being like, it was the fault of this individual or that individual. It is a systemic and historical failure that is the result of a very intentional propaganda effort that was meant to distort an entire period of American history. And so, I think that part of what it taught me is just to, like, always move with humility, because there's so much we don't know. I'm constantly encountering information that I never encountered before about Black history, but also about, like, I'm doing more work around Indigenous history now, and that's a whole nother level of, like, oh, we never talked about this. And yeah, I think that it's the 1811 slave revolt. If you haven't been to the Whitney Plantation, there's a great exhibit there that has the sort of heads of the people who had led the revolt, because what happened is they were decapitated and their heads were put on stakes and spread across the city in order to serve as a warning to anybody who would dare ever try to revolt against the institution of slavery again. And so, there's just so much. There's so much to learn, and there's so much to know, and that's a journey we're on forever. And this book was written. What I hope it feels like for readers is that you are on this kind of learning journey alongside me, because that's why I went on this journey. Like, I went and traveled to these different places because I realized at some point that I didn't understand the history of slavery in a way that was commensurate with the actual impact that it has had on this country. And so I went to these places and talked to these people in order to better understand for myself the legacy that I am living with, and feel very lucky that there were people who were so generous with their time to talk to me.
Kayla is another member of the National Association of Black Journalists chapter here at Loyola, and she's got a little something for my nephew.
Here's a token of the School of Communications.
Well, thank you so much.
Appreciation for your presence here tonight. It was a lovely conversation, don't you all agree?